My name is Jack Collins. At 26, I thought I understood what love was, a straightforward equation of attraction, compatibility, and timing I'd experienced. The rushed, passionate romances typical of college relationships and the more deliberate connections that followed in early adulthood, but nothing had prepared me for the profound connection I would form with someone 60 years my senior, a relationship that defied conventional categories and transformed my understanding of what it means to truly care for another person. I first met Benjamin on a bitter January morning at the Oakwood Literary Society, a small volunteer-run library tucked away on a quiet street in Burlington, Vermont. I had recently completed my master's in literature and was working on my doctorate dissertation about forgotten American novelists of the 1950s. The university library had exhausted its resources on my niche topic, so I had begun exploring smaller collections throughout the state. Oakwood was housed in a Victorian mansion donated to the town decades ago, its rooms converted into reading spaces, while maintaining their original charm: crown molding, ornate fireplaces, and tall windows that let in streams of winter light. The main reading room was empty when I arrived, except for an elderly man seated in a worn leather armchair by the fireplace, intensely focused on an aged volume in his hands. As I approached the unmanned information desk, he looked up, his piercing blue eyes magnified slightly by wire-rimmed glasses. His white hair was neatly combed back, and despite the informal setting, he wore a crisp button-down shirt with a cardigan and well-worn corduroy pants. Something about his posture, straight-backed yet comfortable, suggested a lifetime of academic pursuits. "Can I help you find something?" he asked, his voice surprisingly strong and melodious for a man who had to be in his 80s. "I'm looking for works by or about Elias Montgomery," I explained. He was a novelist who published primarily between 1948 and 1962, not particularly successful in his time. "But I'm researching how his work influenced Montgomery," he interrupted, closing his book and placing it carefully on the side table. "Of course, The Divided Road and Winter's Memory, criminally underappreciated." I blinked in surprise. Most literature professors at my university weren't familiar with Montgomery, let alone casual readers at small-town libraries. "You know his work?" I asked, unable to hide my excitement. "No." It the man smiled, revealing laugh lines that spoke of a life well lived. "Young man, I taught it for nearly 40 years." Scott Harrington, former professor of American literature at Dartmouth. He extended his hand and I shook it, nodding. The paper, thin skin and prominent veins that contrasted with his firm grip. "Jack Collins. I'm working on my PhD at the University of Vermont, focusing on post-war writers who challenged the emerging cultural narratives of the 1950s." "A worthy endeavor." Scott nodded approvingly. "And a pleasure to meet someone interested in preserving Montgomery's legacy." "His third novel, Beneath the Surface, have you read it?" "It's actually the center of my dissertation," I admitted, "but finding critical analysis has been challenging. There's just not much written about him." Scott's eyes lit up with an almost youthful enthusiasm. "I have something that might interest you." Then I knew Montgomery's work would find its audience eventually, so I kept rather extensive notes throughout my teaching career. "Would you like to see them?" That first meeting extended from what I had planned as a quick research stop into a 3-hour conversation. Scott led me through the library's modest Montgomery collection, then supplemented it with insights from his own experience teaching the author. He spoke with the precision of someone who had spent a lifetime analyzing texts, but also with genuine passion that made the dusty novels come alive. Montgomery was writing about alienation and authentic identity decades before it became fashionable, Scott explained as we sat by the fireplace surrounded by books we had pulled from the shelves. "His protagonists always exist at the margins, observing mainstream society while never quite belonging to it, like outsiders with insider knowledge." I suggested. "Exactly." Scott's face broke into a delighted smile. "That's precisely it. Most critics at the time dismissed him as pessimistic, but they miss the profound empathy in his perspective. The outsider sees what others cannot." As closing time approached, I reluctantly began gathering my notes. "Thank you for this. It's been incredibly helpful." The Pleasure was mine, Scott replied, carefully returning books to their proper places despite the leave books on table sign prominently displayed. It's rare to find someone with a genuine interest in the literature. I've devoted my life to studying. I hesitated, then asked, would you mind if I came back? Maybe we could continue this discussion. I'm here every Tuesday and Thursday, he said, a hint of pleased surprise in his voice. The library claims they need volunteers, but I suspect they're doing me a favor giving an old professor somewhere to feel useful. Then I'll see you Thursday, I promised. I returned that Thursday and the following Tuesday and soon established a routine of visiting Oakwood twice weekly. What began as academic discussions gradually expanded to include wider literary debates, philosophical questions, and eventually personal histories. I learned that Scott had taught at Dartmouth for nearly 4 decades before retiring, that he had traveled extensively through Europe in his youth, that he had never married but had, in his words, lived a life rich and meaningful connections. Did you ever regret not having a family? I asked one snowy afternoon about a month into our acquaintance. We had moved from discussing Montgomery to more personal territories as a blizzard raged outside, making the library's fireplace all the more inviting. Scott considered the question with the thoughtfulness he brought to all our conversations. There were moments, he admitted, particularly around holidays or when former students would send photos of their growing families, but regret suggests I made the wrong choice, and I don't believe I did. I chose a different kind of family, one built around intellectual kinship rather than biological ties, like the students you mentored, yes, and colleagues who became friends, the community of minds that gathered around shared loves, literature, ideas, the pursuit of understanding. He smiled softly. My life has been full, Adam. Different from most perhaps, but no less complete. There was something profoundly liberating about these conversations. Scott spoke with the honesty of someone who had nothing left to prove, no social status to maintain. He offered perspectives untainted by the competitive posturing I'd grown accustomed to in academic settings, where every scholarly opinion seemed calculated to advance careers rather than understanding. One particularly cold February day, I arrived at Oakwood to find Scott absent, and from his usual chair the library felt emptier without his presence, and I found myself checking the door repeatedly as I attempted to focus on my research. When he hadn't appeared by closing time, I approached the actual librarian, a middle-aged woman named Margaret. Scott wasn't feeling well this morning, she explained with concern creasing her brow. He called to say he wouldn't make it in. This is the first time he's missed in years. Do you have his address? I asked, surprising myself with my own boldness. I'd like to check on him, maybe bring him some soup or something. Margaret hesitated, weighing professional discretion against genuine concern. Normally I wouldn't share personal information, but Scott speaks very highly of you. Let me write it down. That evening I found myself standing outside a modest Cape Cod house on a quiet street lined with mature maple trees. The windows glowed warmly against the darkening winter sky, and smoke rose from the chimney. Despite these signs of life, I felt suddenly unsure of my intrusion. Our relationship existed within the safe confines of the library. What right did I have to appear at his private residence? Before I could reconsider, the front door opened, and Scott stood in the doorway, wrapped in a cardigan and looking paler than usual but smiling nonetheless. I saw you from the window, he explained, standing in the cold like some literary character, contemplating the great moral questions of existence. I laughed, tension breaking. Nothing so profound. I heard you weren't feeling well and thought you might need some provisions. I held up the bag containing homemade soup, admittedly from the gourmet market, and a few other essentials. That's uncommonly kind, he said, genuine surprise in his voice. Please come in before you freeze. Scott's home was exact lie as I might have imagined it, walls lined with bookshelves, comfortable but well-worn furniture, and evidence of an orderly mind in the careful arrangement of objects. Academic awards and diplomas shared space with art collected from his travels, creating a space that felt both scholarly and deeply personal. It's not much, he said, watching me take in his home, but it served me well these many years. It's wonderful, I replied honestly. It feels Like you, we settled in his small but cozy living room where a fire crackled in a stone fireplace not unlike the one. At Oakwood, Scott admitted to coming down with a seasonal cold, the inconvenient reminder of mortality that winter brings. To those my age, but insisted he was already improving still, he said. I appreciate the company. Being alone with one's thoughts is valuable until illness makes those thoughts turn melancholy. That evening established a new dimension to our friendship while we continued to meet at the library. I also began visiting Scott's home, especially as winter maintained its grip on Vermont well into March. Sometimes I would bring dinner, other times a new book I thought might interest him. He in turn shared treasures from his personal library, first editions with his careful annotations, correspondence with authors now long deceased, the accumulated intellectual wealth of a lifetime devoted to literature. As my dissertation progressed with Scott's invaluable guidance, I found myself sharing more of my personal life with him as well. I told him about my struggle to find meaningful connections in academia, my ambivalence about pursuing a traditional career path, my failed relationships with peers who couldn't understand my devotion to dead writers nobody cares about, as one ex-boyfriend had put it. You have an old soul, Scott observed one evening as we sat before his fireplace sharing a bottle of Burgundy he had been saving for a conversation worthy of its complexity. People have told me that before, I acknowledged, usually not as a compliment, their loss. He said simply, some minds are born out of sync with their generation. It's not about being better or worse, just different. You connect more easily with ideas that have stood the test of time than with the ephemeral concerns of your contemporaries. There was something profoundly validating in his understanding. Throughout my life, I had often felt out of step, too serious, too interested in questions that others my age dismissed as irrelevant. With Scott, I never had to apologize for my enthusiasms or pretend to care about things that didn't matter to me. As winter reluctantly gave way to spring, our relationship continued to deepen. I helped Scott prepare his garden for planting, learning about his surprisingly extensive knowledge of heirloom vegetables. He attended a conference where I presented a paper on Montgomery, sitting in the front row and asking the most insightful question during the discussion period afterward. You've become quite important to me, Jack, Scott said one evening in late April as we walked slowly through a park where spring flowers were finally emerging. His pace had slowed in recent weeks, and he now used a handsome wooden cane that he claimed was more aesthetic choice than necessity, though we both knew otherwise. You've become important to me too, I replied, adjusting my stride to match his more than I expected. When I wandered into Oakwood looking for obscure novels, I've been thinking, he continued, stopping to rest on a bench overlooking a small pond, about the nature of connection between people. So much emphasis is placed on romantic love, particularly when you're young, as if that's the only relationship that truly matters. But in my 86 years, I found that some of the most profound connections defy such simple categorization. I sat beside him watching a pair of ducks glide across the water's surface. I think I understand what you mean, what we have, Scott said carefully. This friendship, this meeting of minds, there's an intensity to it that reminds me of what the ancient Greeks called philia, not the passionate consuming nature of romantic love, but something equally powerful in its own way, a love of minds and spirits, platonic love. I offered, yes, though that term has been flattened in modern usage to mean merely not sexual, he replied with the precision that characterized all his observations. The original concept was far richer, a profound connection based on admiration, respect, and genuine care for another's soul. I considered his words, feeling their truth resonate within me. What I felt for Scott wasn't romantic in the conventional sense, yet it contained a depth of feeling that surpassed many of my supposedly romantic relationships. There was a purity to it, uncomplicated by physical desire, but no less intimate for its absence, I think. That's exactly what we have, I said finally, and I'm grateful for it. Scott smiled, the afternoon sun highlighting the fine lines on his face, a map of a long life filled with both joy and sorrow. As am I, dear boy, as am I. Summer brought new dimensions to our friendship. Scott's health improved with the warmer weather, and we expanded our activities. Beyond libraries and living rooms, we attended outdoor concerts in the park, visited small art galleries, and spent long afternoons in his garden where he taught me the patience required to nurture growing things. Gardening and teaching have much in common, he observed as we carefully stacked tomato plants. Both require you to provide support without constraining natural development. Too much intervention and you stifle growth. Too little and things grow wild without purpose or direction. Which did you prefer? I asked. Teaching or gardening? They said. Different needs, he replied after consideration. Teaching offered the intellectual stimulation of engaging with developing minds. Gardening provides a more contemplative pleasure, watching something grow through your care. But according to its own nature, I thought about how Scott had done both for me, engaged with my ideas while giving me space to develop them independently. You're still teaching, you know, I told him. I've learned more from conversations than from most of my formal education. He looked pleased but waved away the compliment. You'd have found your way without an old professor meddling in your intellectual development, but I appreciate the sentiment. As my dissertation neared completion, I spent increasingly long hours at Scott's house, using his personal library and benefiting from his editorial suggestions. We fell into a comfortable routine: mornings spent in scholarly pursuit, afternoons devoted to his garden or walks when his strength permitted, evenings passed in conversation that ranged from literary analysis to personal philosophy. Have you thought about what comes next? Scott asked one evening in late August. After your dissertation is finished, there's a teaching position at Middlebury that seems promising, I replied. The committee chair hinted rather strongly that I'm their preferred candidate pending completion of my doctorate. That's excellent news, Scott said, though I detected a hint of something like sadness beneath his enthusiasm. Middlebury is close enough that you could stay in the area. The unspoken question hung between us: would our friendship continue when I was no longer bound to Burlington by my studies? The thought of not seeing Scott regularly created an unexpected hollow in my chest. I wouldn't consider accepting a position that took me too far from here, I said firmly. Our discussions are too valuable to me. Relief flickered across his features. I'm glad to hear it. I've grown rather accustomed to your company. Old men are creatures of habit. You know, it's more than habit for me, I admitted. I can't imagine not having you in my life. The simple honesty of my statement seemed to touch him deeply. He reached across the space between our chairs and briefly clasped my hand, a rare physical gesture from someone who typically expressed affection through words rather than touch. Nor I you, he said softly. Fall arrived with its brilliant colors and cooling temperatures. I successfully defended my dissertation with Scott sitting proudly in the audience, and accepted the position at Middlebury, which would begin the following January. We celebrated both achievements with a special dinner at Scott's house, where he prepared a feast that revealed culinary skills he'd never mentioned. Academia's best-kept secret, he joked when I expressed amazement at the perfectly prepared Coke-owned professors who live alone, either learn to cook well or resign themselves to a life of mediocre meals. I chose the former, as we shared a bottle of exceptional wine he'd saved for a significant occasion. Scott became uncharacteristically reflective. I've been thinking about legacy lately, he said, swirling the ruby liquid in his glass. What we leave behind when we're gone. Your students, I suggested. All those minds you've influenced over 4 decades of teaching. Perhaps, he acknowledged, though the nature of teaching is that your influence becomes increasingly diluted with time. Students forget their professors, or remember only fragments of what they learned. Not all students, I countered. Some of us remember everything. He smiled at that. You're kind to say so, but I've been wondering if there might be a more tangible legacy I could leave, such as I've been approached several times over the years about writing a comprehensive analysis of Montgomery's work. Publishers weren't interested when he was out of favor, but with renewed scholarly attention, largely due to your excellent dissertation, I might add there might now be an audience. You should absolutely do it, I encouraged. Your insights on Montgomery are unparalleled. Scott hesitated at my age. Beginning such a substantial project seems optimistic, but I've been considering a collaboration with whom I asked then understood as he looked at me meaningfully, me you want to collaborate with. Me you bring fresh perspectives and scholarly rigor, I bring historical context. In 4 decades of teaching his work together, we might produce something of lasting value. The proposal left me momentarily speechless. To collaborate with Benjamin to create something that would link our names and scholarly records was an opportunity beyond anything I could have imagined when I first walked into Oakwood Library. I would be honored, I said finally. Truly honored, excellent, Scott said, raising his glass to new beginnings. Then our collaboration began immediately, with Scott sharing decades of notes and correspondence related to Montgomery's work. We established a regular schedule, meeting 3 times weekly to discuss structure, themes, and analytical approaches. The project gave our relationship new purpose and depth, transforming our friendship into a true partnership of minds. As winter returned and my teaching duties at Midbury began, I maintained our schedule religiously, driving to Scott's house regardless of weather or workload. Our book took shape steadily, benefiting from the complementary nature of our perspectives, his historical knowledge contextualizing my more contemporary analytical frameworks. But as the winter deepened, Scott's health began to decline again. He tired more easily during our work sessions, occasionally losing his train of thought mid-sentence, something that had never happened before. When I suggested seeing a doctor, he waved away my concerns. Winter and old age, he said dismissively, both temporary conditions. One passes with the season, the other with mortality. Despite his attempts at humor, I noticed worrying signs: weight loss, increased frailty, a persistent cough he couldn't seem to shake. Finally, after finding him unusually disoriented one February morning, I insisted on driving him to his doctor. The diagnosis was what we both had feared but never acknowledged: advanced lung cancer that had already spread to his liver. The prognosis was measured in months, not years. Well, Scott said as we drove home from the hospital, his voice steady despite the death sentence he just received. This puts a certain pressure on our publication timeline. Scott, I began, my voice cracking slightly. No, he interrupted gently. No maudlin displays, please. I've had 86 exceptional years, Jack. That's more than most are granted now. I simply need to ensure that what time remains is used well. In the weeks that followed, we accelerated our work on the book, with Scott dictating sections when he became too tired to write. I rearranged my teaching schedule to spend more time at his house, eventually taking a leave of absence when it became clear that he needed more assistance with daily tasks. You shouldn't put your career on hold for me, he protested weakly as I moved a small collection of personal items into his guest room. I'm not putting anything on hold, I replied firmly. I'm exactly where I need to be, doing exactly what matters most. Our days fell into a new routine. Mornings were devoted to the book while Scott's energy was highest. Afternoons often found him napping while I prepared meals or handled correspondence with our publisher, who had agreed to expedite the editorial process. Evening were for conversation, deeper, now more existential, as Scott contemplated the approaching end of his life with the same analytical clarity he had brought to literature. I'm not afraid of dying, he told me one evening as we sat before the fire, his thin frame bundled in blankets. Despite the warmth of the room, I'm only concerned about leaving things unfinished. The book will be finished, I promised. We're on track for completion next month. It's not just the book, he said, his eyes reflecting the dancing flames. It's the conversations we'll never have, the books I wanted to discuss with you, the evolution of your career I wanted to witness. I swallowed past the tightness in my throat. I'll miss those things too. Promise me something, Scott said, turning to meet my gaze directly. Promise you won't romanticize me after I'm gone. Remember me honestly, strengths and flaws alike. I promise, I said, though I couldn't imagine focusing on his flaws, which seemed insignificant compared to the intellectual generosity and moral courage that defined him. And promise you'll continue your own work, he added. Don't let our collaboration be the peak of your scholarly efforts. It should be a foundation, not a culmination. I promise that too, he nodded, satisfied. Good. Now, shall we continue our debate about Montgomery's use of landscape as metaphor. I believe you were about to concede that I'm right. I laughed despite the heaviness in my heart. I was about to do no such thing. Spring arrived outside, while winter deepened with it. Scott's house. He became increasingly confined to bed, though his mind remained sharp even as his body failed him. We completed the manuscript by working in shorter sessions, with Scott dictating final revisions while I typed them into my laptop sitting beside his bed. The day we submitted the completed manuscript to our publisher, Scott seemed to rally briefly, his eyes bright with accomplishment. "We've done it," he said, a hint of his old vigor returning to his voice. "Montgomery will have his proper recognition at last." "Thanks to you," I said. "Your lifetime of scholarship made this possible." "Thanks to us," he corrected gently. "This book belongs to both of us, Jack. Never forget that." 2 weeks later, as the first tentative flowers pushed through the soil in his neglected garden, Scott Harrington passed peacefully in his sleep. I was in the chair beside his bed, having dozed off while reading aloud from one of Montgomery's novels, when I woke at dawn and found him gone. The silence in the room felt both terrible and somehow right, an appropriate ending for a man who had lived with such dignified purpose. The funeral was more well attended than either of us would have predicted. Former students from 4 decades of teaching came from across the country, sharing stories of how Scott had influenced their lives. Academic colleagues spoke of his contributions to literary scholarship. The Oakwood librarians remembered his unfailing kindness and dedication. When it was my turn to speak, I stood before the gathered mourners, clutching a copy of our book's page proofs that had arrived just days after Scott's death. "Benjamin changed my life," I began simply. "What began as an academic consultation became the most profound friendship I have ever known. He taught me that intellectual connection can be as deep and meaningful as any other form of love, perhaps even more so, for its foundation in shared values and mutual respect." I spoke of our collaboration, of long conversations by the fireplace, of his courage in facing death with the same analytical clarity he had brought to literature. I finished by reading a passage from our forthcoming book, Scott's words about Montgomery that seemed equally applicable to their author. "The true measure of a life well lived is not in accolades received or power attained, but in the depth of understanding achieved and the wisdom passed to others. By this measure success lies not in being widely known, but in being truly known by those who matter." In the months that followed, I found myself navigating grief while simultaneously promoting our book, which was receiving more attention than either of us had anticipated. I resumed teaching at Midbury, but maintained Scott's house, unable to bear the thought of strangers living among his books and memories. 1 year after his death, I sat in his garden, which I had restored to its former glory through much trial and error. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the vegetables and flowers growing in neat rows beside me. On the bench was a letter that had arrived that morning, an offer from Dartmouth to join their faculty as an assistant professor, with specific mention of my work on Montgomery. "I think you'd approve," I said aloud, as had become my habit when making important decisions, "though you'd probably tell me to negotiate for a better teaching schedule." The wind rustled through nearby trees in what I chose to interpret as agreement. I smiled, feeling Scott's presence not as a supernatural visitation, but as the natural continuation of his influence in my life. The Greeks had understood what modern language struggles to express, that love exists in many forms, and some of the most powerful transcend simple Kate oration. Our relationship had been neither familial nor romantic in the conventional sense, yet it contained elements of both the mentorship and guidance of the former, the deep emotional connection and mutual understanding of the latter. It existed in its own unique space, a profound connection that had changed both our lives. As darkness fell over the garden, I gathered my things to go inside to Scott's desk, where I now did my own writing, surrounded by his books and the tangible reminders of his life. Tomorrow I would accept Dartmouth's offer, continuing the academic legacy he had begun. Tonight I would read by the fireplace, keeping alive our tradition of evenings spent in the company of good books and better thoughts. In the end, Scott had given me far more than scholarly guidance he had shown me that true connection isn't limited by age or convention that the meeting of go. Impatchable minds creates its own kind of intimacy, and that some relationships, while difficult to define, leave indelible marks on the soul. The wisdom he shared continues to guide me through each season of my life, a legacy of love that transcends the boundaries of traditional relationships and remains like the best literature, timeless in its truth and endless in its capacity to transform.